They saw me not as a mother, but as a bank account with a fading password. They succeeded in getting it. But they made one fatal mistake. They never asked what was actually in the account. What they found wasn't just about money. It was a quiet lesson in justice that they and you will never forget. My son, Mark, and his wife, Tiffany, they called it helping me with my affairs. It was a phrase that sounded so kind, so responsible. But I heard the echo beneath the words, the hidden meaning that vibrated in the air long after they spoke. They saw me not as Eleanor, their mother, the woman who had bandaged their scraped knees and paid for their college degrees. No, they saw a vault with a fading memory, a living, breathing ATM whose password they could coax out with false smiles and cups of tea, brewed with feigned concern. They looked at my life savings, the quiet accumulation of a lifetime of careful work and Robert's loving foresight, and they saw it not as my security, but as their inheritance. It was the final chapter of my story, a prize to be claimed before the book was even closed. They were wrong. So terribly, fundamentally wrong. They mistook my silence for surrender, my age for incompetence. They thought my memory was a sieve, forgetting that some memories sharpen with time, honing themselves into a fine, sharp blade. And so, while they plotted to inherit my past, I decided to invest it in the future, a future that had no room for their greed. I created a trust, an ironclad legal vessel, and poured my legacy into it. The money that was meant to cushion my final years would now build hearthstones for strangers, providing safe and dignified community housing for the elderly here in our small corner of Kansas. I didn't just move the money. I moved the entire meaning of my life's work. In the end, I left them with exactly what they deserved, full and complete access to an empty bank account, a perfect digital mirror of their own hollow hearts. They logged in expecting a fortune and found only their own disappointment staring back at them from the screen, a balance of $342. It was not revenge, it was clarity. It was a final, quiet lesson in what it means to truly own something and the price you pay when you try to steal what was never yours to begin with. The account was empty, but my life for the first time in years was finally full. Before I was a vault to be cracked or a password to be whispered, I was a wife and a mother. I was a neighbor. My life, the one that truly mattered, was built alongside my husband, Robert, in a small but sturdy house on Maple Street, right here in Wichita. It wasn't a grand place, you understand. It was a simple 2-bedroom bungalow with a porch swing that groaned a familiar song in the summer breeze. But every floorboard, every rose bush I planted in the garden was a testament to our shared labor. The house wasn't just wood and brick. It was the physical shape of our marriage. Robert was an engineer, a man who believed in foundations and structures that were designed and built to last. He saw the world in terms of stress points and load-bearing walls. His hands, though gentle with me, were calloused from a life of making things strong. I was a school librarian, a woman who believed in the quiet, enduring power of stories. I knew that a good story, much like a good house, needed a solid structure to hold it up through the years. Together, we built our life on those two principles, a solid foundation and a good story. We saved. We didn't live extravagantly. Our joys were simple ones. The first peonies of spring, a shared pot of coffee on a snowy morning, the sound of our son Mark's laughter echoing in the yard. We saved diligently, not from a desire for wealth, but for the security that Robert always called peace of mind. He would sit at the small oak desk in the corner of our living room, his pen scratching quietly in the evening light as he balanced his ledgers. He wasn't just counting numbers. He was building a fortress against the uncertainties of the world. I remember him looking up at me one evening, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression serious but kind. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't for us. Not really. It's for the days ahead. It's for the day when one of us is gone. It's for Mark. It's so that the person left behind and the boy we raised never has to worry." That money wasn't just currency. It was a distillation of Robert's love. It was the physical form of his foresight, of his solemn promise to care for me and for our son, even after he was no longer there to do it himself. It was a legacy of love earned over 40 years of shared work, quiet evenings, and unwavering commitment. It was sacred. The house on Maple Street was the vessel of our love, but our son Mark, he was the voyage itself. We poured everything we were and everything we had into him. He was a bright boy, but unfocused, easily swayed by the shifting winds of new ideas and the gravitational pull of new friends. We saw his potential, but we also saw the gentle drift in his character, a tendency to take the path of least resistance. So we invested in him, hoping to build a strong rudder and a steady keel. We paid for his college education, every single tuition bill, every textbook, every lab fee. We wanted him to graduate without the crushing burden of debt that we saw saddling so many of his friends. I remember packing his boxes for his first dorm room at the University of Kansas, carefully folding his sweaters, tucking a little extra cash into his coat pocket for emergencies. Robert had driven him to Lawrence, and before he left, he clapped Mark on the shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "Make us proud, son," he'd said. "Your mother and I, we are your first and biggest investors. Don't ever forget that." We saw it as our duty, yes, but more than that, it was our joy. He was our greatest project. When he met Tiffany during his senior year, we welcomed her. She was sharp ambitious with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She came from the city, and she saw our quiet Wichita life as something quaint, something to be tolerated. But she made Mark happy, and for a time, that was enough. When they decided to marry and buy a house in a newer, more expensive school district, we knew it was far beyond their means. Mark was a history teacher, and Tiffany was just starting her career in marketing. They were drowning in aspirations. We didn't hesitate. I remember sitting with Robert at that same oak desk looking over the portfolio he had so carefully tended. We sold a significant block of stock, the very shares that were meant to secure our own future. We gave them the down payment as a gift. A wedding present. I had called it, even though they had been married for 2 years already. I can still see Tiffany's smile as she took the check. It was a quick, tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone who had just won a prize. "We'll pay you back, Eleanor." She had said, her voice smooth as glass. I had waved her promise away with a laugh. "Nonsense," I'd said, believing it. "Family doesn't keep a running tab." I see now, with the painful clarity of hindsight, that she did. In her mind, there was always a ledger. And on her side of the column, there was only one word more. After Robert passed, the house on Maple Street didn't just grow quiet. It developed a new kind of silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, weighted silence, the kind that reminds you of what's missing. The absence of his footsteps on the stairs, the lack of his cheerful whistling from the garage. These were not just voids, they were presences. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket of grief that I pulled around myself for warmth. My life settled into a new routine, one built around the empty spaces he had left. It was a comfortable routine, if a lonely one. I had my garden where I would talk to Robert's roses, as if he could still hear me through their roots. I had my book stacks of them, silent friends who never failed me. I had my weekly bridge club with 3 other ladies who understood the particular language of widowhood, a language spoken in sighs and shared knowing glances. We didn't need to speak of our loneliness. We wore it like a shared uniform. I started volunteering at the local library again, 2 afternoons a week. The smell of old paper and binding glue was a familiar comfort, a scent from my own past that made the present feel less sharp. My finances were in perfect order. Robert, ever the engineer, had built me a fortress of security. My portfolio was managed by his oldest and most trusted friend, John Abernathy, a man of quiet integrity who still insisted on calling me Mrs. Jensen, as if my status as Robert's wife was a title of honor that time could not erase. I lived frugally. My needs were simple. The account that Robert had built our shared legacy sat quiet and untouched, growing steadily, like a great silent tree in a forest no one ever visited. Mark and Tiffany would call on Sundays, usually in the late afternoon. Their voices were always a little too loud, a little too cheerful, as if they were speaking to someone who was hard of hearing, or perhaps a child. "How are you, Mom?" Mark would ask. "Are you eating right? Are you remembering to take your pills?" Tiffany's questions were different, sharper. "Is the house getting to be too much for you, Eleanor? All that yard work must be exhausting." For a long time, I didn't recognize what they were doing. I thought their questions were stones of concern being tossed gently into the still pond of my life. I see now that they weren't. They were depth soundings, probing for weakness, testing for the first cracks in my independence. For years, I just heard the sound of a son checking in on his mother. It took me far too long to realize I was listening to a survey team mapping out the territory they intended to claim. The change came, as it so often does not, with a roar, but with a quiet stumble. It was a Tuesday in October. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the maple tree outside my window were a brilliant, defiant shade of red. I was in my living room reaching for a book on a high shelf. It was a heavy volume, a history of Kansas Dust Bowl architecture, filled with stark, beautiful photographs. To get to it, I used the small 2-step stool that Robert had made for me years ago. As I reached, the stool wobbled. It was just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I lost my balance. It wasn't a terrible fall. I didn't break any bones. I landed heavily on the rug, my hip, taking the brunt of the impact. The pain was sharp, but the shock was sharper. For a moment, I just lay there, the book open beside me, the wind knocked out of me. It was the first time in my 78 years that my body had truly betrayed me. Lying on the floor of my own home, I felt a profound and sudden sense of fragility. I called Mark. I didn't call him for help, not really. I had already managed to pull myself up into a chair. I called him because I was shaken, and I wanted to hear the voice of my son. He and Tiffany were at my house within the hour. Their concern was a flurry of activity, a whirlwind of puffed pillows and stern, worried pronouncements. Tiffany took one look at my cozy, cluttered living room and surveyed it as if it were a crime scene. "That's it," she declared, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her voice left no room for argument. "You can't live here alone anymore, Eleanor. It's just not safe." Mark, my son, stood beside her and nodded, his expression a mixture of genuine worry, and I now realize profound relief. It was the relief of a man who had been handed a perfect excuse, a golden opportunity. "She's right, Mom," he said, his voice soft and persuasive. "You should come and stay with us, just for a little while, just until you're back on your feet." It sounded like love. In that moment of pain and vulnerability, it felt like a rescue. They were offering me a safe harbor, a place to rest and heal. I was tired. My hip ached with a deep, throbbing pain. I agreed. I packed a small suitcase with a few clothes and my favorite books, believing it was a temporary measure, a short visit. I didn't realize that as I walked out the door of my home, I was walking out of my own life. I was stepping into a role they had already written for me, a part in a play whose final act they had already planned. I was no longer the matriarch of my own home. I was about to become the dependent in theirs. The first few weeks in their sprawling suburban house were pleasant enough in a sterile sort of way. They gave me the guest room at the end of the hall. It was a pristine, impersonal space decorated in muted shades of gray and beige that seemed designed to absorb all light and emotion. The room had a single window with a view of the neighbor's tall wooden fence. There were no family photographs on the walls, no books on the shelves, no sign that anyone had ever truly lived in it. It was a room for waiting. My grandchildren, 8-year-old Lily and 10-year-old Sam, were happy to have me there at first. To them, I was a wonderful novelty, a live-in storyteller, and a reliable source of freshly baked cookies. Their affection was a small, warm light in the cool grayness of that house, and I clung to it. For a little while, I was the honored guest, a role that came with soft slippers and cups of herbal tea. But the role of honored guest, I soon learned, has a very short season. It began to fade quickly, like a cheap fabric left out in the sun. The first thing to go was my identity piece by piece. The few treasures I had brought from my home, the small anchors to my own life, began to disappear. A framed photograph of Robert in his army uniform, which I had placed on my bedside table, was moved to a drawer inside the closet. Just to reduce the clutter, Eleanor. Tiffany had explained with a breezy wave of her hand, her back already turned to me. This room has a very minimalist aesthetic. My title, too, underwent a slow and deliberate erosion. I went from being mom in Mark's conversations to grandma with the children, and then, in hushed conversations they thought I couldn't hear from the next room, I became simply her. As in, can you check if she needs anything? Or, I'll ask her to watch the kids on Saturday. I was no longer Eleanor Jensen, the woman who had built a life, raised a son, and owned the sturdy house on Maple Street. I was a pronoun. I was a permanent resident of the guest room, a piece of furniture that was occasionally useful. The transition from homeowner to guest was complete. I just hadn't been given the checkout time yet. The process of erasing a person, I've learned, is not a single violent act. It is a slow and methodical campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. It's the constant low-grade humiliation that wears you down until you start to believe you are as small as they want you to be. They began to wield what I call the slow eraser. It started in the kitchen, the heart of my old home on Maple Street. I have always loved to cook. The smell of baking bread, the simmer of a good soup. These were the sounds and smells of love to me. But in Tiffany's gleaming stainless steel kitchen, my love was an inconvenience. "Mom, you don't have to cook for us," Mark would say gently, as Tiffany would quietly dispose of the beef stew. I'd simmered all afternoon, murmuring something about it not fitting in with their low-carb lifestyle. My help in the garden, where I tried to bring a bit of my own color to their manicured lawn, was reframed as me getting underfoot and disrupting the mulch. My role as a grandmother, once a joy, became an expectation, and then a chore. I was the unpaid on-call babysitter, the default chauffeur for soccer practice and ballet lessons. They would make plans without consulting me, assuming my time was theirs to schedule. "Don't worry, she's fine. She'll watch the kids," Tiffany would say into her phone right in front of me, as if I were a household appliance like the dishwasher or the Wi-Fi, unseen, unthanked, but expected to function perfectly upon demand. Then came the final erasure. My house on Maple Street. "It's just too much for you to manage from here, Mom," Mark had said one evening, his eyes fixed on the television screen, refusing to meet mine. "All the upkeep, the property taxes, it's a burden. We'll handle everything. It's for the best." They sold it. The house that held 40 years of my life, the home where I had raised my son, was sold to a young couple who painted the front door a shocking shade of yellow. The proceeds, a substantial sum representing the sum total of my life with Robert, were deposited into my bank account, the same account where Robert's legacy sat quiet and untouched. The account that had now become the sole focus of their attention. I had been successfully detached from my home, my history, and my independence. I was now just a woman in a guest room with a very large bank balance. The first time they mentioned my finances, it was an ambush disguised as a conversation. It was a week after the sale of my house had closed. I was sitting at their large granite kitchen island, trying to read the morning paper, but the bright recessed lighting gave me a headache. Tiffany sat opposite me, scrolling through her tablet with a look of intense concentration. "Eleanor." She began, her voice dripping with a sweet, manufactured concern that set my teeth on edge. "I was just reading this awful article. Did you know that financial scams targeting seniors are up almost 40% this year? It's just terrifying. These predators, they can drain a lifetime of savings in an instant." She looked up from her screen, her eyes wide with feigned alarm. Mark, who had been making coffee, chimed in on cue, as if they had rehearsed it. "We just worry, Mom," he said, bringing me a cup I hadn't asked for. "You've always been so trusting. It's one of the things we love about you, but the world has changed." I nodded, slowly, sipping my tea. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice calm. "But I'm very careful, dears. I don't answer calls from numbers I don't know, and I certainly don't click on strange links in emails." Tiffany persisted, leaning forward as if sharing a great secret. "But that's the thing," she whispered conspiratorially. "It's all online now. It's so complicated. Passwords, two-factor authentication. It's a full-time job just to keep track of it all." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air before delivering the payload. Maybe you should let us help you. You know, just to keep an eye on things. To make sure everything is secure." The word help was the key. She used a word so full of kindness that it was almost impossible to refuse. But I could feel it turning a lock inside of me. This wasn't about my safety. This was about their access. They weren't offering to guard the fortress Robert had built for me. They were asking for a map to the treasury. They weren't trying to protect me from predators. They were applying for the job themselves. And in that moment, I understood that concern, when it is insincere, is just another word for control. After my gentle but firm refusal to grant them access to my accounts, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The sweet veneer of concern cracked and fell away, revealing the hard, hungry ambition beneath. The pressure they applied was no longer subtle. It became a constant, low-grade hum of psychological warfare that permeated every corner of my days. Their new strategy was to convince me, and perhaps themselves, that I was incompetent. It was a campaign of manufactured confusion. They would leave printouts of articles about online fraud and elder financial abuse open on the coffee table, the relevant paragraphs highlighted in bright yellow. Mark's anxious questions became more frequent, more pointed. "Did you remember to pay the phone bill, Mom? Are you sure?" because I didn't see the check go through. You know you can set up autopay. We could help you with that if you just give us the login." Tiffany was more direct, her words like small, sharp stones. "You know, Eleanor," she'd say, her voice laced with a theatrical patience that was more insulting than any shout. "If you'd just give us the password, we could set up alerts on our phones. We would know instantly if there was any suspicious activity. We could protect you." They painted a vivid picture of a world teeming with digital predators, with me as the helpless, bleeding lamb, and them as the two noble shepherds ready to fend off the wolves. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The only wolves I saw were the ones sitting across the dinner table from me asking me to pass the salt. They began to treat me as if I were already senile. It was a cruel and calculated performance. They would ask me the same question 3 or 4 times a day, just to see if I would notice. "Mom, did you take your heart medication this morning?" Mark would ask at breakfast. Then Tiffany would ask the same thing at lunch. When I would reply with a hint of irritation, "Yes, Tiffany, Mark asked me that this morning," she would shoot him a look of profound, sorrowful meaning. "See, Mark," she would whisper, just loud enough for me to hear. "She's getting defensive. That's one of the first signs." They were building a case against my mind brick by brick, lie by lie, hoping that if they said I was losing my faculties enough times, I might actually start to believe them. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning of my own confidence. The moment of absolute, irrefutable clarity came on a cold Tuesday night in November. I had gone to bed early, but a dull headache kept me awake, a persistent throbbing behind my eyes. I slipped out of bed and walked quietly down the long carpeted hallway to the kitchen, hoping a glass of warm milk might help me sleep. Their voices drifted from the den, where they thought I was sound asleep, at the other end of the house. They were speaking in low, conspiratorial tones, but in the profound silence of the sleeping house, every word was as clear as a bell. I stopped in the shadows of the hallway, my hand resting on the cool, painted wall to steady myself. "She's being impossible," Tiffany said, her voice a sharp, angry hiss. "I don't know why she's being so difficult. It's for her own good, for God's sake. Anyone can see she's not capable." Mark's reply was weak, weary, the voice of a man who knows he is on the wrong side of an argument, but lacks the courage to cross over. "She's from a different generation, Tiff. They're private about money. It's how she was raised." Tiffany scoffed, a sound like ice cracking in a glass. "Oh, spare me the history lesson," she snapped. "This isn't just about her money, Mark. This is about our future. It's about Lily and Sam's future. That money is just sitting there collecting dust in some low-yield account. Think about what we could do with it. We could finally remodel this god-awful kitchen. We could buy a lake house. We could be free." There was a pause. A long, heavy pause. And then she delivered the line that shattered the last of my illusions, the line that pierced through all my hope and love and memory. "We just need to get the password from the Golden Goose before she completely loses her mind and some lawyer gets his hands on it." I stood there in the dark, the cold of the polished floor seeping into the soles of my feet, traveling up my legs and settling like a block of ice in my chest. A golden goose. That's what I was to them. Not a mother, not a grandmother. I was a farm animal, a creature valued only for what it could produce, for the golden eggs it was expected to lay on demand. The pain was breathtaking. It was a physical thing, a sharp, stabbing agony that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the pain, something else was forming. It wasn't anger. It was something much colder, much quieter, and infinitely stronger. It was the hard, beautiful, terrible clarity of truth. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months. The headache was gone. The cold knot of anxiety in my stomach had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. The next morning, I was a different woman. On the outside, I was the same quiet Eleanor, sitting at the breakfast table sipping my tea, nodding pleasantly, as Tiffany talked about her plans for a new patio. But on the inside, the gears had shifted. The fog of grief and hope and hurt had burned away, leaving behind a hard, clear landscape where my path forward was illuminated with a brilliant, cold light. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next indignity. I had become a strategist. I waited. I learned to be patient, a skill that life teaches all old women. I waited until Mark and Tiffany had left for work, their oversized SUV pulling out of the driveway with a self-important roar. I waited until the yellow school bus had picked up Lily and Sam from the corner. The house was finally, blessedly silent. I went to my room, the impersonal gray guest room, and closed the door. From the bottom of my suitcase, tucked beneath my sweaters, I pulled out the small, leather-bound address book that I had kept for 50 years. Its pages were soft and worn a chronicle of a life filled with friends and family, many of whom were now just names on a page. I flipped to the A section, my fingers tracing the familiar entries. Abernathy John, Robert's financial advisor, and more importantly, his friend. A man who had sat in my living room on Maple Street and shared coffee with my husband for 30 years. A man who remembered who I was. I dialed the number from my simple flip phone, my hand perfectly steady. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, calm, kind, and unfailingly respectful. Abernathy and Sons John speaking, he said. John. I said my own voice, clear and firm, without a trace of the quavering fragility I had been performing for my family. This is Eleanor Jensen. There was a slight pause, and then his voice warmed. Eleanor, what a pleasure to hear from you. Is everything all right? Everything is about to be John, I replied. I need your help. I'm calling about Robert's portfolio. I would like to make some rather significant changes. I was not asking for his permission. I was not seeking his advice. I was giving him instructions. The woman they thought was too confused to manage her own checkbook was about to liquidate a lifetime of careful investment and redirect a legacy. The golden goose was about to fly the coop. The next day, I met John Abernathy at his quiet wood-paneled office downtown. To get there, I had called a taxi, a small and simple act of independence that felt as monumental as launching a ship. As I sat in the back of the car, watching the familiar streets of Wichita slide by, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer just a passenger in my own life. I was taking the wheel. I walked into John's office and sat in the large leather chair opposite his desk. He was a kind man with eyes that held the wisdom of a long and honorable life. He offered me coffee. I asked for tea. He was patient. He let me speak. I laid it all out for him. Not the emotional story of my hurt, not the whispers I had overheard in the hallway. I did not need his pity, and I would not burden him with my pain. I was there as a client, not a victim. I presented him with my plan, my voice clear and concise. John. I began, I want to create an irrevocable trust, a legal entity that cannot be altered or dissolved once it is established. He nodded, his face unreadable. His hands steepled on the polished surface of his large oak desk. He just listened. I want to liquidate the entirety of my main investment account, everything that Robert and I built, and the proceeds from the sale of my house, and transfer the funds into this new trust. He still said nothing, but his eyes never left mine. He was assessing me, I knew. He was looking for signs of coercion, of confusion, of the very incompetence my son and daughter-in-law were so keen to prove. He found none, and I want the sole beneficiary of this trust. I continued to be a new charitable foundation. He finally spoke, his voice soft. A charitable foundation, Lehner. What kind of foundation? I had already thought of it. The name had come to me in the quiet hours of the night, a perfect summation of my purpose. I want to call it the Hearthstone Community Trust, I replied. A hearthstone is the foundation of a home. It's the center of its warmth and its strength. The Trust's mission will be to develop and support safe, dignified, and affordable housing for seniors here in Kansas, for people who, for whatever reason, find themselves in need of a place to call their own. A small, sad smile touched John's lips. He understood everything I wasn't saying. He looked past me at a photograph of him and Robert on a fishing trip many years ago, both of them young and smiling. I think Robert would be immensely proud of you, Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with a sudden emotion. He turned back to me, all business now. Let's get to work. The 2 weeks that followed were a silent, invisible ballet of legal and financial maneuvers. While I continued my performance as the slightly confused, gently fading matriarch in my son's home, John Abernathy and his team of lawyers and accountants worked with quiet, surgical efficiency. It was a transfer of power that took place entirely on paper, in the quiet hum of computer servers and the rustle of signed documents. The money, the magnificent sum that represented Robert's love and my life's work, began its quiet journey. The carefully tended stocks, the municipal bonds that Robert had purchased decades ago for their stability, the large cashier's check from the sale of the house on Maple Street, all of it flowed like a great and silent river from my personal account into the secure, untouchable vessel of the Hearthstone Community Trust. With each transaction, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The money was no longer just my money, a target for the greed of others. It now belonged to a purpose. It was being transformed from a private fortune into a public good. From the remaining funds, I had John perform one last set of actions. He set up a new modest checking account for me at a completely different bank, a small local credit union. He arranged for my Social Security and my small librarian's pension to be deposited there directly. The account contained just enough for me to live comfortably, but simply for the rest of my days. There was nothing left for a new kitchen or a house on the lake. The original account, the one my son and his wife coveted, the one whose password they were hunting like a sacred trophy, was now a hollow shell. It was a beautiful, empty stage waiting for the final act of a play only I had read the script for. After all the transfers were complete, after the trust was funded, and my new small life was secured, the balance in that account, the grand prize they had been working so hard to claim, was $342.16. Enough for a week's worth of groceries, perhaps, but not enough to build a future on. I was no longer a golden goose. I was no longer a vault to be cracked. I was just a woman with a plan, a woman who had finally remembered that the truest ownership is not about what you possess, but about what you do with it. Now that the trap was set, all that was left was to bait it. Back in their house, I leaned into the role they had created for me. I became an artist of feigned weakness, a master of strategic confusion. I would ask them what day it was moments after looking at the calendar on the kitchen wall. I would misplace my reading glasses, which were often perched on top of my head, and send them on a frantic search. I let them see the woman they so desperately wanted to see, a confused, vulnerable, and rapidly declining elder who desperately, urgently needed their help. The pressure for the password, their holy grail, reached its fever pitch. They came to me one evening after the children were in bed. They sat on either side of me on the living room sofa, a tactic I'm sure they thought was comforting, but which felt like being cornered. "Mom." Mark began, his face a carefully constructed mask of strained sincerity. "We're at our wits' end. We can't sleep at night for worrying about you. What if there's an emergency? What if you need money for a hospital stay and we can't get to it because we don't have the password? We need it, Mom. We need to be able to help you." Tiffany, for her part, remained silent, but her presence was a heavy weight beside me. She had her arms crossed, her jaw tight, her eyes like chips of flint fixed on my face, watching for any sign of weakness. This was it. This was the final act. The curtain was about to fall. I let out a long theatrical sigh, a masterpiece of weary resignation. "Oh, I just don't know," I quavered, my voice thin and reedy. "It's all so confusing, all these numbers and letters. My mind isn't as sharp as it used to be." I let them wheedle and cajole for another 10 minutes. They used every tool in their arsenal: guilt, fear, love, frustration. I let them exhaust themselves. Then, with a final shuddering sigh that seemed to signal the collapse of my last defense, I gave in. "All right," I whispered, as if the words were being pulled from me. "All right?" I looked from Mark's anxious face to Tiffany's triumphant one, and then slowly, deliberately, I recited the username and the password to the old, now empty bank account. I watched the look of victory flash between them, a shared predatory gleam that they didn't even try to hide. They thought they had won. They thought the golden goose had finally foolishly laid her last and most valuable egg right in their laps. I went to my room and closed the door. A quiet and final click that sealed the end of an era. I didn't need to listen at the door. I could feel the energy in the house shift, a palpable thrum of greedy anticipation. I could hear them, even through the wall. There was no pretense of whispering now, no false concern for the sleeping old woman down the hall. I heard the scrape of a chair as one of them pulled it up to the desk in the den. I heard the lid of the laptop open. I heard the quick, eager clicks of the keyboard as Mark typed in the password I had so generously provided. I imagined them leaning in close together, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of the screen. I pictured their hearts pounding with a shared, feverish excitement, their minds already spending the money furnishing their lives with the fruits of a harvest they had not sown. I could almost see Tiffany's hungry smile, her eyes wide with triumph, as she leaned over Mark's shoulder, waiting for the numbers to appear. And then, silence. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a profound, heavy, vacuum-sealed silence. It was the silence of a grand and glorious expectation crashing headfirst into a barren, brutal reality. It was the sound of a dream dying. The silence was broken by a muffled curse from Tiffany, a sharp, ugly word that hung in the air. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "This can't be right. Refresh the page. Do it again." Mark's voice, when it came, was thin, reedy, and laced with a dawning panic. It says $342. There must be a mistake. A glitch in the system." "There's no glitch, you idiot!" Tiffany's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a furious, unrestrained snarl, the sound of an animal whose prey had vanished from the trap. "She's done something. The old witch, she's done something to us. I lay in my bed, my hands folded calmly over my chest, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile in the darkness. The performance was over. The truth was out. The vault they had worked so hard to crack was, and always had been, gloriously, beautifully, and justly empty. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was thick with a toxic, unspoken rage. They didn't confront me at breakfast. Tiffany moved around the kitchen with a tense, violent energy, slamming cabinet doors and glaring at me over the rim of her coffee cup. If looks could kill, I would have been dust on her pristine tile floor. Mark simply stared into his oatmeal, his face pale, and drawn the picture of a man who had gambled and lost spectacularly. They didn't have to say a word. Their silence was a confession. Then the deluge began. My simple flip phone, which usually sat quietly on my bedside table for days at a time, began to buzz. It was a text from Mark. "Mom, we need to talk about the bank account. There's a problem." I looked at the message, a small, quiet smile touching my lips, and I ignored it. An hour later, another message, this one more urgent. "Mom, this isn't funny. Where is the money? Call me." Then the calls started one after another, a frantic and desperate drumbeat against the quiet of my morning. I let them all go to voicemail. I saw them huddled together in the kitchen, their faces tight with anxiety, speaking in frantic whispers as they scrolled through their own phones, probably trying to call the bank, trying to unravel a mystery whose answer was so simple, yet so far beyond their comprehension. They had been outsmarted. The woman they had dismissed as a senile old fool had erected a legal fortress around her legacy that they would never breach. I had already arranged for a car service to pick me up at 10 o'clock. While they were out in the garage, their voices rising in a panicked argument, I packed my 2 small suitcases. I went to the closet in the guest room and took the framed photograph of Robert from the drawer where Tiffany had hidden it. I placed it carefully on top of my clothes, a small act of reclamation. I walked out of the guest room past the den where they had plotted my financial demise, through the gleaming kitchen that would never be remodeled with my money, and out the front door. I did not look back. The car was waiting at the curb. As we pulled away, my phone buzzed again. The screen read 99 plus missed calls. I turned the phone off and set it in the bottom of my purse. I didn't need it anymore. Silence, I had learned, is the only reply strong enough to be heard. My new home is a small, sunny, one-bedroom apartment in a senior living community on the west side of town. It's a pleasant, well-run place called Prairie View. The name is fitting. My window, unlike the one in the gray guest room, doesn't look out at a neighbor's fence. It looks out over a wide green lawn that slopes down to a small pond where ducks gather in the afternoon. I can see the vast Kansas sky from my armchair, and I watch the thunderstorms roll in from miles away. The Hearthstone Community Trust. My trust had already made its first official donation, a sizable one, to this very community. My lawyer John had arranged it. The funds were designated to help subsidize the rents for residents on fixed incomes to ensure that no one would be forced to leave their home because of a small increase in their cost of living. In a strange and beautiful turn of events, I had become my own beneficiary. The legacy Robert and I had built was now, in a small way, sheltering me. The community manager, a kind and bustling woman named Sarah, had welcomed me warmly when I arrived. "We are so incredibly grateful for your foundation's generosity, Mrs. Jensen," she had said, her eyes shining with genuine appreciation. "You have no idea what a difference this will make for so many of our residents." I smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached my eyes. "Please," I said. "Call me Eleanor." I unpacked my 2 small suitcases. I placed the framed photograph of Robert in his uniform on my new bedside table right where it belonged. I arranged my favorite books on the built-in shelf, my silent, steadfast friends. The quiet in this new room was different from the heavy, oppressive silence of the house on Maple Street after Robert was gone. It was different from the tense, angry silence in my son's house. This quiet was light. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the rich, textured silence of peace. My mornings are my own now. I wake when I please. I drink my tea while watching the sun rise over the pond. I have joined a book club. I play bridge on Thursdays with 3 sharp-witted ladies who cheat good-naturedly and make me laugh until my sides hurt. I am for the first time in a very long time simply Eleanor, and it is more than enough. I often sit by my window in the afternoon here in my new room with its wide view of the sky, and I think about the nature of a legacy. I think about my son and his wife. I do not feel vengeful. I do not feel triumphant. I feel a sense of profound, quiet rightness, like a perfectly balanced scale. I didn't take anything from them, not really. I simply removed what was never theirs to begin with the product of a lifetime they did not live and a love they did not honor. Their inheritance is not a number in a bank account. Their inheritance is the stark, unvarnished truth of their own character, a heavy weight they must now carry for themselves for the rest of their days. My legacy, the one that Robert and I so carefully built, is no longer a silent, sleeping dragon of a bank account waiting to be plundered. It is alive. It is active. It is the cornerstone of a building that will one day stand on a plot of land downtown, offering warmth and safety to others. It is the quiet dignity of a woman who can afford her own rent in a place of her own choosing. It is peace. It is the knowledge that the love Robert and I shared has been transformed into something that will outlive us all. And if you are listening to this, if you have ever been made to feel that your worth is measured only by what you can give away, if you have ever been called a burden in the very house you helped to build, if you have ever been seen as a password instead of a person, then I want you to hear this. Your value does not reside in a ledger. Your history is not a commodity to be liquidated. You are the foundation, and you alone are the one who holds the deed to your own soul. Remember that. Remember it before they try to make you forget. Thank you for joining us for this story. If her journey moved you, if you recognized a piece of your own story in her quiet battle for dignity, then you've found a home here. Don't forget to subscribe to Her Quiet Revenge, True Stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a testament. We believe that stories like these are not just entertainment. They are a vital reminder that silence is not weakness, and it's never too late to reclaim what is yours. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. We'll see you in the next story.